I'm going to show you an example and a way of writing better film characters so more people will want to watch your next movie project. And we're starting right now. So a lot of new filmmakers have the same worry, and that is, can they write characters interesting enough to keep their audiences on the edge of their seat from that very first frame to the very last one? And it's important as a new filmmaker to be able to write the best possible characters that you can, because when you compare what your film is going to look like to something that a Hollywood studio or Netflix might dish up, with all the finance they have and you don't, the only two factors you really have a chance of competing on with these big productions is story and character. And stories, as catchy as they are, don't quite stand the test of time anything like character. Think about it. Take your favourite movies, for example. When you speak about what it is that you like about them, when you just remember why it is you want to watch them again and again and again, where does story come in that list of priorities? I bet it's not as high as what the characters look like, what they say, and what they do. So how do you do that? How do you create characters that are so interesting, so engaging and memorable that your audience will take those characters with them once they leave the movie theatre? Well, there's actually more than one way of doing this, but at the top of the list of ways of doing this right now comes in the form of an excellent character example. And this isn't just an example of a well-written character. This is an example of a character that was actually quite poorly developed originally, but has since been re-engineered and redrafted into a character that the audience are going to root for from that very first scene to the very last. And the character in question is Dr. Madeleine Swann from the James Bond film Spectre and now No Time to Die. Now, if you've seen Spectre, whatever you might think about it, the reaction to it in general was kind of so-so. One of the problems the movie has is James Bond's counterpart and love interest, Dr. Madeleine Swann. Character is just underwritten, just not very well developed as characters go. And if I had to think back to things about that character that made her memorable, I think I might struggle. She is a psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist. She lives in or works in a big snowy place, like a ski resort. Her dad was a bad guy, like an accountant bad guy for the bad guys. She wore a white dress on a train. She's French. She's Swiss. Is that just the actress that plays her? Okay, so even the things I can remember don't actually make her a very memorable character. And in that sense, she's kind of a bit of a throwback to a lot of other Bond female characters that were all really quite poorly underwritten. The rule of thumb until the Daniel Craig era came along was, as long as the female counterpart had a name that sounded like it was better suited for the adult entertainment industry, then that would be enough for her to be remembered long after James Bond had saved the world from another mad scientist and his plot to take over / destroy the world. Not great. Imaginative, but, well, some, but not great. And that last one seems relatively safe until you realise it's used as probably the filthiest punchline in James Bond history.
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
Last line of the film. And weirdly, that did actually work for a while. Giving those female counterparts those names did mean that their place in Bond history lasted a lot longer than most of the storylines. Well, they were remembered for that and what they wore or didn't wear. But in a more grown-up 21st century filmmaking world, bikinis and porn star names aren't actually going to cut it when it comes to writing better, more well-developed characters. But female characters or not, here's where the problem lies with Dr. Madeleine Swann. We've got a character with a fairly forgettable name, with a fairly forgettable job, who is in some way related to a bad guy in this series. And this is kind of all we have. And by the end of the movie, this is the character we're meant to believe that James Bond wants to ride off into the sunset with, into spy retirement. James Bond, married to Tracy Bond, in love with Vesper Lynd. That's two characters in almost 60 years of films, in a long line of relatively poor written characters. It almost feels lazy that the writers think that they can persuade us that this character matches those two in particular because of the things they said and the things they did in their own respective movies. But it's at this point that things start to turn around for for the character of Dr. Madeline Swan. Because given the ending of Spectre, it was quite clear that she was going to have to return for the next movie. Well, at least for the start of it, for any of this to make sense. And if the writers had still had their lazy hats on, they might have come up with some kind of concept around the idea that she croaks it in the first 5 minutes or so, and then James Bond goes on some kind of revenge rampage. But Daniel Craig's Bond has been down that route before, and that film wasn't particularly great either. So how do you do it? How do you take a first or second draft character and turn them into something that the audience is going to root for? Turns out that the writers of No Time to Die actually had their very best writing hats on when it came to putting this movie together and re-engineering the character of Dr. Madeline Swan. Because what we get is a far superior, far more interesting and far more relatable character than we did when we saw her last in Spectre. And there's some very specific things they do that we can also use when developing our own characters and getting the best out of them. By the way, there is a little bit of a spoiler alert here. I am going to give away some of the details from the first 10 minutes of No Time to Die, but that's all. Everything is pre-credit sequence. Firstly, they actually give her real focus and attention as a character. They make it known that this is someone we should be paying attention to. And they do this by making the character of Madeline Swan just as important to this movie as James Bond. Now, how do you do that in a franchise that's been dominated by the same character for almost 60 years? Well, you can start by making the entire opening sequence entirely about her. No Bond in sight whatsoever. The very first sequence in No Time to Die is of Madeline as a little girl trying to evade an assassin who has broken into her home and is trying to murder her family. Basically doing a very James Bond thing. Escaping the bad guy with guns, shooting her way out, and doing all of this whilst being something like the age of 8 at the time. It shows she's brave, it shows she's cunning, and despite all the trauma that she's experiencing, she knows that she must survive. Which leads us to a very important thing that we have to include in our characters too. The ability to surpass the expectations our audience has of that character. She's a young girl, she's playing in her room. So far, it's everything we'd expect from that picture. Very quickly, we begin to learn more about her and she becomes much, much more. Firstly, she's a nurse to her mother. Then she's the last line of security to the family home. She looks like a girl that's just hiding under the bed in her room, but very quickly she becomes the girl that knows how to aim a gun and take out an assassin who's trying to kill her. It's impressive, we don't expect it, and all good characters do impressive things we don't expect of them. And when this taut, kind of scary sequence ends with a bit of a cliffhanger, we snap back to Madeline of the here and now. And this is the first moment we realise that this is her, this is the character from Spectre. Only this time, we've actually bought into the character even before we knew that's who she was. Which in itself is another great trick you can use to surpass the expectations of a character. Which is great, because had we known it was her going into that sequence, our leftover bias from Spectre might have shaped the way we saw that scene play out. It might have made us think about the character differently. We don't know, it's a complete surprise, and in doing so, this character's surpassed our expectations even further. Most importantly, now we actually have buy-in to this character. We actually care about them. They're someone we want to root for because we now know far more about them than we ever did before. And what we know about them is really impressive. And this brings us to the next thing that we should be trying to instill in our characters to make them more interesting to an audience. We need to make them key to the story at large. More importantly, we need to get this point across as quickly in our story as possible. In the first sequence of No Time to Die, we discover Madeline Swan's past trauma, what it is that's actually haunting her, and that she has a will to want to survive. Does this sound like anyone else we know? In the second sequence, when Madeline snaps out of her flashback and we see her in the here and now, we see them as a couple who are both haunted by things in their past, promising each other that they'll try and come to terms with these past events so they can move on together and actually live happily ever after, or whatever spy retirement actually looks like. And just like that, Dr. Madeline Swan becomes James Bond's equal within this story, with as much to lose or gain as he does through whatever happens next. In the space of the first 10 minutes of No Time to Die, we buy into the character of Madeline Swan in a way that we could never have done in almost half of Spectre's runtime. I think she shows up about halfway through that movie. And then the film doesn't just become another Bond film, although yes, it has all those Bond tropes that you would expect to see. It becomes a film in which the stakes for their happiness hang heavy over everything, particularly over the audience, from the very beginning of the movie to the very end, because this is now a character that we care about. And if you can introduce a character early on that gives your audience those kind of feelings, that emotes them in that way, then they're going to stick around to see what happens to them at the very end. And more than that, they're going to tell other people about it too. So if you're drafting your characters at the minute, or you're just thinking about what you want your characters to be, and so far they're nothing more than a job, someone's relative, or a hobby, then ask yourself this question: how can I surprise my audience into liking my character? What can they experience on screen that can make them both sympathetic and heroic? And how do they continue to survive when life just seems out to get them? Most importantly of all, why does it matter if this character makes it through your story? And it doesn't even matter if they make it through or not, but why is it going to matter to your audience? Because they really care about them. This is how we write more interesting, memorable characters. This is how we write better movies. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. And if you want more videos like this one, hit that subscribe button too. But if you're struggling to even think up a character or even nail a story idea, then I suggest you click on this video here, because it's going to show you how to kick writer's block in the... I'll see you there. Thanks for watching, filmmaker.